Well, good
Hi,
evening,
Steve.
everyone, and welcome to the second of our 2022 Chifley Conversations series. We're going to be joined tonight from the land of the Ngunnawal people, Dr Abul Rizvi, and of course the land of the Ngunnawal people is where the Chifley Research Centre is located, and I'm speaking to you tonight from the land of the Dja Dja Wurrung people of the Kulin Nation. We'd just like to pay our respects to elders past, present and emerging on the lands from which we join you tonight, and also those elders past, present and emerging of the lands from which you're joining us tonight. So welcome to this Chifley conversation with Dr Abul Rizvi. I'll just get Abul to turn on his camera in a minute and we'll introduce him. Tonight's conversation has been made possible with the generous support of the leading strategic communications firm, Michelson Alexander. Dr Rizvi is one of Australia's most foremost experts on population policy and the strategic importance it has for our socio-economic well-being. Abul is currently a senior associate with Michelson Alexander and was a former Deputy Secretary of the Immigration Department. Last year, he published his thoughts on how we need to better manage population and economic strategy in Australia in a book called Population Shock for Monash University Publishing. There's few people better qualified to talk about these topics. Abul's expertise and influence has been recognised with a Public Service Medal and a Centenary Medal for services to the development of Australia's immigration policy. He indeed holds a PhD in population and immigration policy, and during his distinguished service as a Commonwealth official, he managed Australia's migration program from 1995 to 2007. And in that time, among other things, he commissioned Australia's first intergenerational report in 2002. For those who may not be familiar with the report, it prompted some major policy changes to boost that ended up boosting Australia's international education industry, our skilled temporary migration program, and having that program together with the Working Holiday Makers program emerge as a pathway to an expanded permanent migration policy. Importantly, these initiatives very much had Australia showing the way in how you deal with population ageing and inequality that arises with it in developed nations. We've been able, as a result of these policies, to remain younger, more diverse and grow faster than many of our comparable developed nations across the world. Abul has a firm view that Australia has to confront the implications of a multi-stage population shock, a phenomenon that is also faced by most other developed countries. He notes that Australia's population will rise over the next 40 years, regardless, but will age greatly. And with that, growth could slow and debt and inequality could rise. Tonight, I want to begin by asking Abul to expand on these thoughts and asking what can we do and what should governments do better to manage our population and economic future. Abul, welcome.
Thank you very much for that, David, and welcome everybody. I'll run through a few slides very quickly, but I want to leave aside a good amount of time for questions and answers, because I know this is a topic that elicits a lot of questions. Hang on a sec. Okay. The book that I published last year fundamentally lays out the 4 stages of what I describe as the 100-year population shock. And that shock fundamentally follows the life cycle of the baby boomers. Stage 1 was when the boomers were in childhood, when we had very strong rising private consumption, but very weak workforce growth. It was a period that we were able to actually repay much of the government debt that had accrued during World War II. Stage 2 is when the boomers are in adulthood. Strong private consumption, young families spend a lot of money, and strong workforce growth, as we had probably the biggest or the fastest increase in our workforce in our history taking place as the boomers reached adulthood. Stage 3 is as the boomers reach old age, where we experience much weaker private consumption. Older people spend less generally than younger people, and we had weaker workforce growth. And stage 4 is a stage most people don't like to think about, but it comes, and it'll come to all of us, and that's when the boomers start to die out. That will occur probably in Australia from around 2030, when the boomers start dying out in bigger numbers. The way I categorise the 4 stages is to divide it into the 4 stages based on a ratio of the working age population to the total population. Now, that essentially looks at the ages 15 to 64 divided by the total population. I use 15 to 64 because that's the most easily available data, comparable data from around the world. Yes, you could debate whether that's the right ratio or not. Frankly, if you use different ratios, you come to the same conclusion. So it doesn't actually make a lot of difference. What this graph shows is 4 countries, 2 very similar countries in Australia and Canada, with very similar levels of fertility and similar approaches to migration. And it compares China and Japan, 2 countries with very little immigration. Indeed, China has a great deal of immigration. And what it highlights is the steady decline. If you look in particular at the China graph, that's the black line, you'll see a sharp decline in the working age to population ratio from the 1950s through to about the 1980s. You then see the steepest increase in the working age to population ratio of any nation ever in the history of the world. And by 2010, you'll see that ratio peaks for China and then declines. It declines quite steeply. That graph is based on projections by the United Nations. And I should say the projections by the United Nations are quite conservative in terms of China's fertility rate. The United Nations assumes China's fertility rate will rise to 1.75 children or births per woman by the end of the century. China's fertility rate at the moment is 1.3 births per woman, and there is no sign of it rising. So that steep decline that the China graph shows may be much steeper. By comparison, Australia and Canada, the working age to population ratio declines, but it does not decline nearly as rapidly. And that is fundamentally because of immigration. In other words, immigration gives us more time to adjust to aging, whereas countries such as Japan and China will have to face aging in a much more abrupt fashion. In the late 60s and 70s, interestingly, when Paul Ehrlich was writing The Population Bomb, there was a fundamental change taking place that Ehrlich, surprisingly, did not notice whilst he was writing his book. In the 60s and 70s, women changed the world. They changed the world because they went from relatively high fertility rates to a steady decline in fertility that started in the 60s and 70s and has continued to this day. Fundamentally, the result of the availability of the pill, more women going into higher education, more women having careers, more double income families, led to a steady decline in fertility, a decline that goes on to this day. What that led to was that the world's population growth, rather than continuing to climb as Ehrlich suggested it would, actually started a steady rate of decline. And that is projected to continue. Now, these figures are based on the United Nations projections. And I would note, the United Nations is a very conservative organisation when it makes projections such as this. Most other researchers in this space project that decline that's shown in that graph much more steeply. I want to now just go back to how governments around the world responded to the strong aggregate demand of the second stage. That's the stage when young baby boomers were pouring into the labour market. Young female baby boomers were also at the time pouring into the labour market. And many of you who've been around for a while will remember these phrases, as I've used some of them quite deliberately. Many of you will remember Milton Friedman talking about needing to fight inflation first through tight monetary policy, pushing up interest rates, constraining the money supply. Sounds all a bit quaint now. Keeping a lid on wages and reducing the power of unions was all the go in the 70s. Indeed, it was all the go in the 80s. Even Bob Hawke, in his own fashion, reduced the power of unions. Flattening income tax structures. We had to incentivize rich people to work harder, and so we brought down the highest rates of marginal income tax, often above 70 and 80%, to much lower levels. We increased consumption taxes because apparently consumption was evil in those days, and restraining consumption was a good thing. Consumption taxes were viewed as a good thing in those days. We reduced company taxes to encourage companies to invest more in increasing productive capacity. Well, certainly Australia, abolished inheritance taxes. And we introduced, but only in a modest way, a tax on capital income. And of course, in the 80s, as Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan told us, smaller government was good and privatisation was just fantastic. So let's have a think about what all of that gave us. One of the things that it gave us was when the baby boomers started to hit the labour market very, very rapidly, that's in the early 70s, we see inflation rates rising rapidly. And against that background, you can understand why governments argued about fighting inflation first. This graph compares inflation rates for Australia, that's the yellow bars, with Japan, and that's the grey bars. The reason I compare Australia and Japan is because in many ways, as developed nations, we are polar opposites. We are amongst the youngest developed nation on the planet. Japan is the oldest developed nation on the planet. They started aging much earlier than we did. Japan started aging around 1990 in terms of the decline of its working age to population ratio. Australia didn't reach that point until 2009, almost 20 years later. What this highlights is the extent to which Japan, despite its extraordinary expenditure in terms of government debt and its extraordinarily loose fiscal policy, massive amounts of quantitative easing, and over the last decade, negative interest rates, still hasn't seen much inflation. Now, this year, we are all told we will see high levels of inflation after all the investment, after all the expenditure or stimulus put into various economies. The real question for me is, will the underlying effect of ageing be the long-term factor, and what we're going through at the moment is a temporary experience? I'm inclined to the temporary view. I know many people are not inclined to the temporary view on inflation. The other thing that occurred from the 1970s and 80s onwards was that the labour income share of national income, of GDP, steadily declined. It declined from a very high level in the US very significantly. It declined very significantly in Australia. We are at the point where the labour share of income is at its lowest level in over 50 years. And that was a function of policy. That wasn't an accident. We drove down wages and we incentivised capital income. Not surprisingly, the balance between the two switched. But we're now into the third stage of the population shock, a very different world, a very different environment, an environment where the working age to population ratio is declining and the portion of retirees in the population is rising and rising rapidly. And the characteristics of this phase, firstly, weak private consumption. Essentially, older people don't spend as much as younger people, especially people in the early stages of household formation. We have slower workforce growth, slower growth in hours worked, low wage growth and rising wealth inequality, weak business investment, low productivity growth, and intense pressure on government budgets. If you think that just describes Australia, you'd be wrong. It describes every developed nation in the world. So I did some comparisons. Now, what this table does is compare household consumption before these major developed nations reached the peak of their working age to population ratio. And remember, each of these nations reached that peak at different times. So I'm comparing different times for each nation, but I'm comparing the period before, the 15 years before the peak for each nation and the period after the peak for each nation. And you can see the dramatic change in household consumption as populations age. Every one of these major economies has had significantly weaker private consumption once its working age to population ratio has peaked. Just another quick comparison, and this is real GDP growth based on the same time periods. So comparing 15 years before the working age to population peak and the period after. In every instance, real GDP growth declines. I'm not telling anyone anything new here. Population aging has a negative impact on economic growth. We've known this for decades and decades and decades. While some may wish to deny it, the statistics are pretty overwhelming. And here's some more looks at the same issue from a slightly different perspective. Let's have a look at it in terms of income tax paid by age by type of Australian household. So the blue line there is income tax paid by couples only, so excluding children, under the age of 65. By comparison, the brown line is couples only over the age of 65, the income tax paid by that group. An enormous difference. Now, that is partly due to deliberate policy, but it's also partly due to older people having lower incomes. And similarly, if you compare lone households under the age of 65, that's the orange line, and lone households over the age of 65, that's the grey line. Once again, a very big difference. In other words, as populations age, per capita income tax declines. Now that was the third stage of the population shock. I want to now turn to the fourth stage. And people may think, oh, that's a long, long way away. Well, for Australia, it's still quite some time away. That's true. We will probably be the last developed nation that enters the fourth stage when deaths exceed births. That'll depend predominantly on the level of immigration, but we will probably be close to the last. Over the next decade, there's a whole host of nations. Firstly, on the left-hand side are predominantly nations in Asia who will reach the fourth stage over the next decade. China will probably get there very soon. Japan's already been there for many years. And those other countries, including many nations in Central Asia, will reach that stage over the next decade. Similarly, many European nations will reach that stage. So we will have a situation where most of Northeast Asia, indeed all of Northeast Asia, and most of continental Europe will have negative population growth for the foreseeable future. It's always good to look at China because I think China's a fascinating, in addition to Japan, is a fascinating case study. You can see the working age population of China rising very rapidly and it starts to rise very rapidly from about 1975 onwards. Its working age population then peaks at around 2010, 2015, and then steadily declines. That period when China's working age population increased dramatically was, of course, coinciding with the enormous rise of China. When the working age of population of China declines, and it will decline more steeply than that graph shows because these are UN figures, what happens? Yes, efforts will be made by the Chinese government to prevent the decline and to prevent economic contraction, but it won't be easy. In Australia, we sort of recognised this towards the end of the 1990s. And what we did was ramp up, as David's described, our permanent migration program, particularly the skills stream. And you can see the rise in the skills stream from about 1999 onwards. It's now fallen back again a bit. The government is projecting it to resume rising. Exactly how it will rise, the government hasn't explained. It's just made this assumption in the budget that it will rise. I don't have a problem with it projecting that it will rise. I just love it if they'd actually explain how they're going to do it. That would be good. The results of doing that for Australia, of increasing that immigration program in the way we did, we have now the youngest population in the developed world. We have the largest portion of overseas born, and we have the fastest growing population in the developed world. Well, at least until COVID, we did anyway. Another way of looking at this is the number of retirees in the population. Once we reached the point where our working age to population ratio started to decline in 2009, you can see what's starting to happen with the number of, this is the absolute number of retirees in the population, starts to rise rapidly. In the last set of figures produced by the ABS, it was rising by about 90,000 net per annum. That's net of deaths. So you've got retirees entering the cohort of retirees, and then you've got retirees dying. And this is the increase after you remove the ones that died. Rising very rapidly. That will continue for another decade or so, at least, until the death rate of the baby boomers accelerates significantly. Here's a little comment from Thomas Piketty on population and ageing and inequality. He argues that inequality rises when economic growth is less than the rate of return on capital. A good way of looking at the rate of return on capital is the rate of return on superannuation. In Australia, it's been between about 7 and 10% per annum for about a decade now, way above the rate of economic growth, way above the rate of wage increase. As a result, inequality in Australia has increased significantly. And let's go back a little further, and it's always good to think about what John Maynard Keynes thought, for an economist anyway. He said, with a stationary population, we should be absolutely dependent for the maintenance of prosperity and civil peace on policies increasing consumption by a more equal distribution of incomes. In other words, if you're facing a rapidly aging population, one of the best things you can do is tackle inequality. And yet we in Australia seem to be intent on doing the opposite. So what should Australia do? Well, it's quite clear. I would take Keynes's opinion any day of the week, and we should address the rising inequality in Australia to strengthen aggregate demand. We should attempt to slow the rate of population ageing in a sensible way, but it's important that we do slow it if we can. Support for young families to prevent a further decline in our fertility rate. Our fertility rate is now about 1.6 births per woman, lowest in our history. We should try to prevent it falling much further. We need sensible immigration policies, and we need to plan for a much larger elderly population. It's coming. If the current crisis in aged care and our health system is any guide, and don't assume that's all just COVID, it's not. This has been coming for some time, and it'll keep coming at us in terms of the impact on the health system and on the aged care system. Well-managed immigration will be essential. I'm neither a big immigration man or a small immigration man. I think if you get the settings right in terms of design, you'll get a good outcome. Government assumes long-term net migration of 235,000 per annum. That's the highest assumption ever made in any intergenerational report, much higher than Mr. Rudd, actually, when he talked about big Australia. So this is actually bigger Australia than Mr. Rudd's big Australia. But the government's provided no details on how it's going to do that. We're rapidly becoming a low-skilled guest worker society, and the government keeps changing policy to give higher emphasis to low-skilled guest workers and lower emphasis to permanent skilled migrants. That's just the wrong way to go. Those guest workers are going to compete with the largest cohort of unsuccessful asylum seekers we've ever had in the country. If you thought Mr. Rudd lost control of the visa system with the arrival of boats, what's happened in the last 6 to 7 years, makes that look child's play. Tiny numbers compared to what we've had in the last 6 to 7 years, yet no one talks about it. Biggest labour trafficking scam in Australia's history. A big difference between the asylum seekers who arrived when Mr. Rudd was Prime Minister and the asylum seekers who have arrived currently is that the asylum seekers who arrived when Mr. Rudd was Prime Minister are almost all found to be genuine refugees. The current group are almost all being found not to be genuine refugees. And of course, we've got a massive increase in the number of bridging visas. I think it's important we go back to some basic immigration policy principles. Firstly, I think we ought to reaffirm Bob Hawke's commitment to non-discrimination in the permanent migration program. That's important, I believe, and we're starting to lose that. We need to minimise the number of people in immigration limbo. We have too many people in those situations. We need to commit to efficient and timely visa processing, because untimely visa processing rewards the unscrupulous, penalises the genuine. We need to manage partner and dependent child migration on a demand-driven basis, as Parliament always intended. We need to provide permanent protection for genuine refugees, and we need to be genuinely transparent about consultation on migration and population policy and stop playing the silly political games that we do. Thanks, David. I'm sorry I took a bit longer than I should have.
No, look, I think all of us could have stood a lot more of that. That was very comprehensive and very clear. If I can summarise some of your messages, I mean, it seems to me what you're saying is that the post-war developed world model of the West has depended very much on policies that assume a relatively young average working age population. And
yes.
Clearly for a number of reasons, as the baby boomer cohort in particular has matured, the developed world now confronts an ageing population which is less suited to sustaining the sorts of economic strategies that we are used to and the productivity models that indeed we are used to. And that probably partly through efforts of yours, and certainly the efforts of some governments over recent decades, Australia's probably made a better fist of it than many other countries, although possibly with some advantages as being a new world country and not having suffered the ravages of war, etc., etc. But that inevitably it's going to hit us. And as I said, we were making not a bad fist of it, but perhaps now not such a good fist of it. And where you're landing is that we have to rekindle a more thoughtful population and particularly immigration strategy to basically sort of rebuild some of the good work that we were doing. My question to you would be, before we take some questions, and we're already getting a lot of questions on the Q&A function where I'd ask people to direct their questions rather than the chat, and we'll get to them in a minute, is how do we rekindle that more thoughtful model of producing population and immigration policy? Because we do seem to have drifted, and we particularly seem to have drifted and perhaps had a couple of wake-up calls during the pandemic because the borders have been shut. So it's brought things home perhaps a bit more starkly than it may have.
Yeah. I frankly, David, that's a really, really big question. And I think we need a root and branch review of our immigration policy. And there is so much that needs to be done. But as I said, there are some basic principles that should guide us. And I think Bob Hawke's non-discrimination principle is a good place to start. I think fundamentally we need to rethink the idea that there are some jobs Australians will not do. And in the 1990s, I talked to a lot of my colleagues in other countries, and they used to lament at the extent to which farm workers were being exploited and abused in their countries. And I used to walk away smugly thinking, God, glad we didn't do that. Well, we're just heading straight into that now. And we know what happens when you bring in farm workers with few protections to work on farms around Australia. That's just not the Australia we should be moving towards. I think the mistakes made in North America and Europe with low-skilled guest workers, we should not repeat. But that will be difficult because the lobby groups involved are powerful. And to push back against them any government that tries to push back against them will meet enormous resistance. It'll be very difficult. We need to deal with the situation of the refugees, the legacy caseload. Leaving them in detention is just bizarrely stupid now. It's achieving nothing other than a political aim, and I'm not even sure the political aim's much value either. We need to deal with that. But we also need to deal with the 95,000 asylum seekers who have arrived subsequently and are out in the community and subject to extraordinary levels of exploitation. They have no protections at all. And as they move through the system and they come out as unsuccessful asylum seekers, they then have no work rights either. They're in an incredibly vulnerable situation, and we have to deal with that.
Yep.
We've got massive backlogs in the visa system. We've got to get back to the idea that efficient visa processing is good policy. It's not an optional add-on. It's not a thing you do because you just have to. It's not a thing you do or you avoid because it's not sexy. You do it because it's a core government function and you fund it appropriately. Now, all of that will take a lot of money. It'll take a lot of time. It'll be difficult.
If I just interrupt your flow there, that latter point, is that a product of benign neglect or deliberate neglect, or a bit of both?
It's probably a bit of both. I think some of our ministers in the recent past and some of our bureaucrats in the recent past have not had much experience of immigration policy. And they didn't think efficient visa processing was particularly exciting or interesting. There were other things that were sexier and captured attention. Efficient visa processing, I mean, the population says, well, yeah, of course you should do efficient visa processing, you know, just taking that as a given. Well, we don't anymore. We're appalling at it. And as a result, we have massive backlogs that are just unsustainable.
So if we could just focus a bit more on this, you know, the ethical dimension, the citizenship dimension of all of this. You've mentioned the challenges that we face with refugees, the humanitarian program, and indeed the, you know, emergence of a possibly quite challenging de facto guest worker policy, particularly in the agricultural sector. But there's another dimension to all of this, even if you were to have what you argue for, you know, an orderly skills-based program. And Sue Strottle's put her finger on it. She's asking, to what degree do we have to think about the consequence of disadvantaging other nations by taking their skilled and young families in order to improve the working age profile of our own economy?
And that's a very good question. We need to remember we live in a world where mobility, well, at least until COVID, mobility was rapid. People no longer viewed themselves as being tied to any one nation. They move rapidly around the world, and they will, after COVID, I assume, continue to move rapidly around the world. They will go to jobs that offer them the best return for their skills. We, prior to COVID, used to lose about 20 to 30,000 Australian citizens every year because they were offered better job opportunities. It is a competitive world. And unfortunately, whether we like it or not, we're going to have to compete, because if we don't compete, we'll actually see more Australian citizens leave the country to greener pastures where they get offered good jobs because they've got great skills.
Fair enough. We've got another question here. And the question is asking, well, they believe that you're indicating that the current migration policy is moving away from the non-discriminatory. And we're just wondering, you know, whether you could clarify that, particularly, you know, why you say it, you know, just through some examples.
Okay. So in 1989, the Parliament passed a motion that Bob Hawke introduced following a suggestion by Mr. Howard that we should move to a more discriminatory migration program that reduced the level of migration from Asia. You'll recall some ministers crossed the floor to support that motion, including Philip Ruddock. And since that time, we have not had any permanent migration visa category that explicitly discriminated in favour or against any particular nationality. In the last few years, we've introduced 2 such visa categories. Few people noticed, but we introduced one that is you're only eligible if you're a New Zealand citizen. I thought, yeah, all right, okay, you can probably make an argument there. We then introduced one for Hong Kong citizens, and I thought, oh, hang on, this is getting a bit odd. Surely the Immigration Department is advising the minister that is contrary to the non-discriminatory principle that Bob Hawke established. So they're 2. I'm hopeful they're the last 2.
Right. I'll just switch tack for a moment. Edward Smith, who you may know, I think Edward's involved with Sustainable Population Australia. He's asking whether falling economic growth has any benefit for the environment, and does improvement in the environment have any benefit for governments that are inclined to spend political capital on it? And how does that fit in with population policy?
All other things equal, a larger population will have a greater environmental footprint. So if our population was larger by, in 50 years, by 10 million, that would, all other things equal, have a greater environmental footprint. That's true. But all other things are not equal. We will age, and if the faster we age, the greater the impact on our ability to afford investment in changing the emissions composition of our economy to achieve zero net emissions. What I have seen around the world is that nations which are struggling from an economic and budgetary perspective tend to be the most reluctant to invest in changing their economies into low emission economies. And that is the crucial change that's got to take place. If we can convert the economy into a low emissions economy, we can readily afford the extra 10 million. And it may well be that the extra 10 million enables us to afford the change to a low emissions economy.
We've had a couple of people who are asking a similar question, but from a more economic perspective. And they're saying, what does it really matter if we do have lower aggregate demand when you've also got fewer people looking for jobs, for example, and presumably over time, albeit with a bit of a lag, less people to support? Surely these things will cancel each other out. What do you have to say to that?
I think that ignores the age composition of the population. The age composition of the population has a dramatic impact on both government budgets, as we've seen, and it has a dramatic impact on wage growth. It has a dramatic impact on economic growth. To the extent that, if you compare us to Japan, and that's the most appropriate comparison because it is the oldest population on the planet and it's the easiest way to compare. It is a population which is now struggling to find a way of importing workers to support its ageing population. It's very unused to managing migration. Migration is very new to the Japanese, and coming at it cold with very little background in managing immigration is hard. We've got 70 years experience compared to the Japanese after World War II, after Mr. Chifley, of course, was the man who initiated all of this. That difficulty will continue for Japan and will get worse and worse as its population ages and shrinks. The shrinking does not stop. There is somehow this assumption that once we've got to stage 4, it's a steady state. It's not. We keep aging and we keep shrinking. A good way to think about a country which is facing the Japanese situation is to think about the last country town you went to with about 5,000 people. The country town may have 20 years ago had 20,000 people, 30,000 people, but it's shrunk. And its population is predominantly aged, a substantial portion in an aged care home, very little employment income, very little contribution in terms of taxes paid, but massive demand in terms of services required. Just think about that as a nation. Think about one of those country towns as a nation. You don't want to be there.
Yeah. Against that, some people are saying that when we've been pursuing a growth policy, and we've had, quite substantial population growth in Australia, particularly over the last 5 years, and indeed, up until the pandemic, there was consensus around forecasts that there would be even more substantial population growth on the East Coast. And with that has come things like conurbations. And we get some colourful advocates, like, for example, Bob Carr, who would argue that the Sydney Basin is a very strong geographic feature and it's full up, but people still keep coming there. And as a result, aside from the influence of other policies and aside from things like low interest rates, we've got massive increases in housing costs, and people are suffering the effects of congestion, possibly exacerbated by a lack of public transport infrastructure investment, et cetera, but they're suffering from it. So we're getting these sorts of sentiments. It's causing people to question things. It's clearly a widespread concern because our current Prime Minister in 2019, at his last election, put his finger on it without particularly defining it and spoke generally about congestion and said he was going to do a U-turn on immigration policy and indeed bring what he called the immigration ceiling down.
Yes.
I'd be interested in your response to that, and perhaps a subsidiary question is, notwithstanding what the Prime Minister said in 2019, he produced a budget last year which seems to have completely the opposite assumptions about population growth, not necessarily the composition of population growth. And we don't hear a thing about it.
Yes.
How do we reconcile these things?
Well, I'd actually say that in March, when the Prime Minister announced his, quote, population policy, which looked nothing like a population policy because it didn't talk at all about our population future, but he did call it a population policy because it was going to bust congestion. And he produced that in March. In April, the Treasurer produced a set of budget papers that assumed the fastest rate of net migration growth in our history. They were a month apart, those two documents. So he was referring to Treasurer was referring to net migration. The Prime Minister was referring to permanent migration. Related, but different things. And why did you need such a large rate of net migration assumed in the 2019 budget? Well, it was, of course, the Back in Black budget. It was the budget that was predicting that we would create 250,000 jobs per annum. You can't create that many jobs per annum unless you've got a very high level of net migration. So Treasury was confronted with, how do we reconcile these two? And they reconciled them by making an assumption that net migration would go up a great deal. So let's leave aside the political game playing. That was just political game playing. You've asked a very good question about congestion. And absolutely there is a congestion issue that's got to be dealt with. And that requires sensible investment in infrastructure and in various services. No question of that. And if we're not going to do that, then the risks associated with the current level of assumed net migration is problematic, no question. But you shouldn't make the assumption that if we had lower levels of net migration, we would have lower levels of infrastructure requirements. That wouldn't be the case. Have a look at Japan. Japan's got negative population growth, yet for the last 20 years, it has had massive investment in infrastructure, predominantly to try to keep the economy competitive. You, of all people, would know, David, that, of course, Japan was one of the first countries to invest in fibre to the home in a big way. Japan is a leading investor in rapid rail transport. They have some of the best airport and sea infrastructure on the planet because they're a big exporting nation and they need that infrastructure. So whilst they may not be building many houses, that's true, the need to invest in infrastructure doesn't go away just because you've got negative population growth or no immigration. That would be an incorrect assumption.
Right. Is the strategy of trying to shepherd the distribution of population growth and indeed the distribution of incoming immigrants to particular areas or particular sectors effective? I'm
going to have to give a yes answer to that.
And indeed, if it's not particularly effective at the moment, can it be made effective ever?
It's partly effective. So we have what are called state-specific migration mechanisms, where we try to direct people to settle in various parts of the country. In particular, South Australia, Tasmania, Western Australia are eager participants in these programs, as are country New South Wales and country Victoria. The key question people ask is, well, how many of those people actually stayed after they were visaed to live in Adelaide? It depends on what you regard as success. In this regard, I always viewed if 50+% of the people stayed in Adelaide who were visaed to Adelaide after the relevant legal requirements, that was pretty good because that was more than Adelaide would have otherwise got. So in my view, yes, they work, but they don't work in the way people think they work, and you have to lower your ambitions in terms of how effective they're going to be. Finally, of course, it fundamentally depends on the way we set up our infrastructure in these places and the way we develop job opportunities. The government is constantly looking for ways to create job opportunities in Adelaide. We're still trying to do that, I suppose.
So you think it's dependent on a broader range of measures aimed more generally at the existing economy rather than necessarily immigrants per se?
I think that's right. I think that's right.
Yeah.
You've got to treat immigrants as normal human beings, and they'll behave like normal human beings. Australians, they will go where the job opportunities are, and if you create the right job opportunities in the right places, that's where they'll go. We had massive levels of immigration, overseas migration as well as internal migration to Western Australia when the mining boom was on, and then the whole thing collapsed when the mining boom collapsed.
We'll have to close off soon, but I just want to sort of get to something that's in the immediate, because what we have tended to be talking about is multi-decade trends and recent changes to immigration policy that actually predate the pandemic. They go back to 2018-19. But of course, one of the most interesting developments we've seen is the impact of the pandemic on the interlinkage between Australia's education sector, particularly the export education sector, the intake of students, and their interaction with the general structure of the Australian labour market. Now, at the very start, we spoke about pathways, where you were one of the people involved in developing pathways where people could come in under things like education visas, which are essentially temporary streams, and shift up the spectrum, as it were, to acquire permanent visas as a result of the skills and experience they'd acquired in this country, and possibly as a result of the wealth that they acquired while working in this country as students. And that's clearly become a very important part of solving some of the issues in our labour market, where Australians are not necessarily native-born Australians are not necessarily the first people to stick their hands up for lower skilled jobs. I'm not saying that's a hard and fast rule, but it does seem to be a bit of a trend, and we seem to have filled the gap with a range of temporary workers, but particularly students. And there does seem to have been a bit of a coalescence, particularly at the lower end of the higher education intake and at the vocational end of the temporary visa intake, where in effect these schemes have become, number one, a de facto guest worker arrangement, and number two, part of the business model of our higher education and vocational education sector, where domestic governments are less willing to fund educational institutions off the budget and are encouraging so-called export services, but the response of the institutions is actually to become collaborators in developing this low-skilled labour pipeline. Suddenly the tap has been turned off, as it were, with the borders closed. And it's not necessarily apparent that even when the borders are open, it's going to be suddenly turned back on. How do we deal with that?
I think the first thing I should say, David, is the government has got to stop being schizophrenic in terms of overseas student policy. On the one hand, in the recent education strategy, Minister Tudge wrote that we need to focus on the skills and workforce development that overseas students provide, clearly signalling that he thinks a pathway to permanent residence for overseas students is a good thing, which I believe it is. It is a good thing. At the same time, the visa system says you must meet what is called a genuine temporary entry test. And if we suspect you're thinking about permanent residence, we'll refuse your visa application for a student. Well, you can't have it both ways. It's got to be one or the other. In my view, it should be sensible pathways for students to permanent residence. We should understand that the students are going to be part of our future workforce, and we should, particularly after they obtain permanent residence, the idea of guiding them into both geographical areas where they're going to be, where their skills are going to be needed, as well as into skills where we need their skills, has value. It is a good thing to do that. But what we shouldn't allow happen is to convert the student visa into a work visa. The primary purpose of a student visa should be study, and we should ensure that the education they get is of a high quality that will be respected and valued by Australian employers, and not one where employers think, oh, I think you've probably got a dodgy degree and I won't employ you. And to some degree that happens. So it's a matter of designing and regulating this to deliver Australia the best possible benefit and to not mislead students in terms of what we're offering them. I think converting the student visa, like we have, into a work visa, and the changes that have been made in the last few months in that have been, in my view, appalling, where we basically said a student visa is primarily a work visa and you can do a bit of study on the side. That's just wrong. That is just wrong, and downstream that will be disastrous doing that. And I would turn that off as quickly as possible.
Okay, so I was going to ask you a question, how do you safeguard both quality and also equality to stop these sorts of schemes and these sorts of changes to student visas, both diminishing the quality of educational outcomes, educational offerings, and potentially creating an even more two-class, two-stream labour market program?
Yeah.
Where you've got people stereotypically riding around on delivery bicycles or working at the back of kitchens or whatever,
yep.
or perhaps even, in the fields picking strawberries,
yep.
Under some appalling labour standards.
Yep. I mean, that's a big question, David, and there are a range of things that have got to be done. The first thing that's got to be done is our labour market protections have to be significantly stronger. The government for 3 years promised a bill to strengthen protection of migrant workers. The bill that they produced was very, very, very weak. And surprise, surprise, they won't have enough time to introduce it before the election. So it won't happen. So a weak bill to protect migrant workers when we desperately need it won't proceed. You've got to have a much stronger bill in that space. You've got to fund the Fair Work Ombudsman much better than we do. They are drowning in work. We've got to fund them properly. Thirdly, there's got to be a strong role for unions in this space. The assumption that unions don't have a role in this space is just poor policy. Unions must have a strong role in this space because they can be effectively the best protector of migrant workers if we give them that role. And we should explicitly give them that role. In terms of regulating quality, we have 2 quality agencies that look after the quality of education delivered to overseas students. We need to strengthen their powers, and we need to encourage them to act quickly when these sorts of things occur. We know what bad quality education looks like. We've worked that out. We know what bad providers look like. We've worked that out. We let too many of them survive when they should be closed down.
Well, on that note, I want to thank you very much. You've been very lucid, very measured, and given us a lot of detail tonight. And I think the audience have appreciated it. So thank you very much. I'd also like to thank Michelson Alexander, who I believe pay your bills these days, but also help support this event tonight. It was tremendous of them to support the event, and also Monash University Publishing. For those of you who hadn't caught it in some of our promotions, Abul's book Population Shock came out late last year. It's available from Monash University Publishing, and as they say, all good bookstores. But if you do go online to Monash and apply the Chifley 20 code, you'll get it cheaper than elsewhere. So a bit of microeconomic reform through the Chifley Research Centre there. Thank you very much. I do appreciate it. This, as I said, has been the second in our series of 2022 conversations. Next week, we'll be joined by Dr. Andrew Leigh, who will be familiar to many of you as both an economist and a member of Parliament. And we'll be discussing the questions of automation and digitalisation under the topic, will robots take your jobs? But we're talking about a bit more than robots, because there's a very, very live debate going on at the moment as to whether we've reached a stage where we're seeing a lot of automation for automation's sake, and it's tending to produce no longer producing the economic growth outcomes and the productivity outcomes that we assumed, but at times just simply increasing labour market inequality. As I said, there's a debate around that. Some people are a bit more sceptical on it. Andrew had a good look at it back in 2019, but he's been revisiting it in an Australian context. So he will join us next Thursday. That's a departure from our normal time, which is a Wednesday night. So next Thursday night, we'll be joined by Dr. Andrew Leigh. But in the meantime, thank you very much, everyone. Good night, stay safe, get vaccinated, and thank you again, Abul, and thank you again, Michelson Alexander.
Thank you, David.